Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Sony a6600. So you might ask, why am I reviewing the a6600 in 2021 rather than the beginning of 2020? It's a good question, and one I think whose answer really ties into my final verdict on this camera, and I'll circle back towards that towards the end of this review. As the Sony a6600 is a bit of a paradox. The paradox is that this really is an excellent camera. It is probably the best APS-C camera that Sony has ever produced, and really helps to put together various pieces of Sony's technology into one package that just does a lot of things a little bit better than anything that we've seen previously. But the paradox aspect of this is that while it is a camera that is excellent, as I've noted, it feels very much the same as a lot of what we have seen for a while. And ironically, for a company known so much for innovation, the a6600 is anything but an innovative camera. It really feels more like a Canon release of 5 or 6 years ago, more so than a Sony one, and that it is incremental at best. It's a refining of existing technologies and merging some of them together as opposed to really pioneering anything new. And it's in some of those areas where in times past Sony has had some market division as being above the rest of the competitors. At this stage, on many levels, the competitors have caught up and even surpassed Sony, and that it becomes relevant to my final conclusion on this camera. Now today we're going to do our definitive review and break things down in detail, and if you want a quicker to the point type review, you can check out the standard review instead. And I also am going to have another companion episode where I break down the various strengths of the a6400 and the a6600, both of which I happen to own and so I'm quite familiar with, and kind of to help you to maybe make a choice between those cameras and to help you to spend your money wisely. And so look out for that also. Today's episode is brought to you by Lens Nest, the stylish and innovative new way to store and display your lenses. This new product is designed and produced by a fellow photographer and is made with high-quality cork, a biodegradable material which has been extracted as a byproduct during the process of manufacturing cork bottle stoppers. This makes the Lens Nest eco-friendly, along with being highly durable, and it smells good in my dry cabinet too. Lens Nest is designed to be expandable to fit your growing collection of lenses and creates a designated space for lenses, keeping them organized and easy to grab. Get your Lens Nest in either natural cork or the limited edition dark gray by visiting bit.ly/lensnest to join the Kickstarter campaign and to help bring this stylish new lens storage system to market. We're going to start today by taking a closer look at what has changed, what hasn't changed, the various aspects of build, design, and features. And so let's explore that with a bit of an overview here. Now, in many ways, the a6600 is a very familiar looking camera. You would have to look at it from certain angles to be able to tell any difference between it and models like the a6400 or the a6500 before. The biggest way you're going to be able to distinguish that is by looking at this much thicker grip. And if you compare it to, say, the a6400, you can see that it's a much more shallow grip relative to what we see on the a6600. And that is to accommodate one of the killer features and upgrades here, and that is that much more significant MPFZ100 battery that is going to give you more than twice the battery life relative to the older FW50 battery packs. And so that makes it a much better camera for me to hold in my hand, having a much more usable grip. And so it's a very appreciated thing for me. Though those of you that value being small and light, we have gotten a little bit larger, at least in this dimension, and a little bit heavier, about 100 grams, up to 503 grams, making this only a little over 100 grams lighter than, say, the A7 series cameras. But you have a similar magnesium alloy, weather-sealed camera here that has a lot of good things going for it in terms of the build. A few other areas of differentiation from the A6400 and some previous models is that you do have a headphone monitoring jack here on the side. You also have 3 additional custom buttons, the C1, C2, and C3 buttons that are located here. And that is because where the C3 button would sit along there on the A6400 was the place where you would push the button to pop up the onboard flash. We don't have that on the A6600. They've gone away from having an onboard flash, probably with an understanding that few people use that onboard flash. However, if you're a person that likes having an onboard flash, you may miss that. Things that haven't changed, maybe should have, are the viewfinder. The viewfinder is still a relatively small 0.39-inch opening with 2.36 million dots of resolution. Pretty standard fare that we've been seeing for a while. Likewise with the touchscreen. It is, starting with the A6400, it could be rotated 180 degrees, so it is front-facing, though you'll note if you have the eye cup on, it will obscure just a tiny bit of the screen there. And so we are still just tilting, nothing to the sides here, and so if you're in a vertical position, you're kind of out of luck. But it's also the same resolution that we have seen at 0.92 million dots, and also it has a similar degree of functionality that we've seen with previous cameras, in that you really can't do any kind of navigating of menus. You can just do things like touch to focus and different aspects like that. You can move a focus point around, but what you can't do is navigate either the FN or quick menu or the full menu. That's an unfortunate thing there as well. Likewise, inside we have got the same sensor we've seen for quite a while now in Sony cameras, a 24.2 megapixel CMOS sensor. It is a very good sensor. However, there's no advancing the ball here. Still ISO 100 to 32,000. And we also have an identical focus system to what we saw on the A6400, and that is with 425 phase detect points. That is backed up by 425 contrast AF points, or what they call a hybrid focus system. You also have the identical burst rate up to 11 frames per second and identical buffer depth at 46 RAWs or 116 JPEG images. Likewise, we have the same video specs, 4K 30, and to get faster speeds, you're going to have to drop to full HD instead. A few other things that we do have, though, is that we do have the steady shot inside. So this has Sony's in-body image stabilization, which is obviously a very, very welcome thing. And it is a little bit, in my experience, works a little bit better than what I saw on the A6500. One improvement that we do have to our autofocus is that when it comes to video, you have the real-time IAF working for video, not just for stills. And that is for either humans or pets. And so that is obviously a welcome addition as well. Everything else feels really, really similar here. The buttons have a similar travel and feel to them. You know, same positioning of most of these buttons. Very little is different in that regard. You do have a couple of custom positions here on the mode dial, and so that is a welcome change as well. But everything else, the shutter button, the various dials, all of these things feel highly similar. The single SD card is located down here in the battery compartment. And so finally, our dimensions of the camera. It is 120 millimeters in width. It is 66.9 millimeters in height. And the only real change is the depth of the grip, which has grown from around 60 millimeters on previous bodies like the A6400 out to nearly 70 millimeters to accommodate that thicker battery or higher capacity battery. And as noted, that is a very welcome change. So of course the headline here for me is that new and improved battery, and going from the FW50 battery to the Z100 battery makes a huge difference. And on paper, that difference is the difference between about 410 shots per battery to 810 shots per battery. But in real life use, I would say the difference is even more extreme than that. Primarily if you're going to be shooting video, whereas with the smaller battery pack, these cameras just really ate through them very quickly. And I find that there is just much more durability for shooting longer format with the Z series batteries installed. I think the best illustration for that is that I took this camera with the 18-135 as my sole travel option on a quick trip to Texas recently. And over the process of the trip, I took well over 400 images, some video clips. I did a lot of showing images on the back of the camera to people, reviewing things, you know, the kind of things you do when you travel. And I was pretty impressed to get home at the end of the trip and have 50% of the battery charge still remaining. And I can assure you, if I had been traveling with something like the A6400, I probably would have needed to charge the battery a couple of times over that same duration. So it really is quite a liberating thing. At the same time, however, there's a lot of things that should have been improved that haven't been improved. You know, the viewfinder, the LCD screen, some of the, the basic ergonomics where you still don't have a third control wheel at the front near the shutter button. And so I do really appreciate the extra custom buttons because in some ways it's necessary just to get at some basic functionality of control of the camera. And so I really do think that it's time for Sony to update that design, to give us a little bit of a joystick, even if it's just a little nub like what's on Fuji's cameras. Something like that is really, really necessary at this point. And so I think that it's time for Sony to do some further improvements to the ergonomics of the A6000 series cameras. Because in many ways, while this is the best yet and that grip is appreciated, there's still some areas where innovation is needed by Sony. So how about the autofocus? Once again, there's a lot of great things to point to, and then one puzzling and disappointing aspect. Let's dive in and take a look at that. The primary leap forward for the Sony a6400 was the updating of the focus system to a more robust 425 phase detect point autofocus system backed up by a hybrid 425 point contrast AF system. That gave you pretty much not quite 100% coverage, but coverage over most of the frame, but also included some of it was actually the first to pioneer the Sony tech of having real-time IAF for both humans and animal subjects. And of course, we've seen that technology proliferate over a number of other platforms at this point, but it actually was first introed on the a6400. So in this case, we have got that same focus system with another minor addition, though it could be an important one, in that real-time IAF is also now included for video capture as well. So whereas the a6400 might track a face and obviously had real-time tracking capabilities, it didn't have real-time IAF. And so the processing has been upgraded here to include that ability. So obviously that is a significant, could be a significant improvement depending on what your video functionality is. But what is clear here is that we've got a much more stable autofocus system than what I saw. For example, I owned the a6500 for years. And now I own both an a6400 and an a6600. And in both of those cases, they're just much more stable, reliable platforms. You know, for example, for what I'm doing right now, I'm filming on the a6600 and I'm actually using the kind of kit lens 18-135 millimeter. And I have every confidence that it's going to reliably track my face. I use either the a6400 or a6600 in church settings as, kind of our primary film camera for there. I use it for, video episodes, and I just find it to be reliable. And for example, if I had to do my, kind of typical approach to the camera, and allow it to track my face, my eye during that process, you can see that it accurately and smoothly does that. And so in many ways, for that kind of application, don't overread what I'm about to say, but for that kind of application, the stability is not really all that far off from what I see, say, from my Alpha 1. Now, obviously, it's not as a robust or intelligent a system for, for tracking capabilities. The Alpha 1 is in a class of its own. However, this is a really, really good autofocus system. And in many ways, I think that this might be the chief advantage over, particularly for video, over, say, the Fuji X-T3 or X-T4 type offerings, and that while those cameras do have things that Sony lacks, and we're kind of highlighting some of those in this review, when it comes to the autofocus for video in particular, we're at a whole nother level of stability and reliability and smoothness in the tracking. And so I think that remains one of Sony's chief advantages. Now, when it comes to tracking capabilities, this certainly is a camera that is capable of tracking a fast action, and it has a fairly good 11 frame per second burst rate, which is obviously very useful. Where I'm disappointed in this application is when it comes to the buffer depth. I thought that the aberration to the A6400, where the buffer depth, it shrunk significantly, to use the, the reference of raw files, for example, we went from somewhere around 110 raw files down to in the upper 40s. And so that's a significant reduction. Basically it was half the buffer depth that we saw. You could get over 300 JPEGs with the A6500, and you're barely over 100 JPEGs here. That's a serious drop. And I thought, well, sure, they're going to, have some market differentiation. And so the A6600, or, whatever it would be called, would make that back up, and we would have probably even deeper buffer depth and probably even faster burst rate. We didn't get either one of those things. And so I'm really disappointed to see that the A6600 shares the A6400's buffer depth, even though that this is priced at a whole nother level. And so that's an unfortunate reality here, and certainly one that needs to be rectified with the replacement for the A6600. So as far as the ability of the camera, it has very, very good abilities. Unfortunately, where I think things are lacking is in the pipeline when it comes to the buffer depth and transmitting that information. It's time for some upgrading to the memory card status there, and then also probably a more robust processor that's able to push a few more images through that pipeline to get us back up to at least the levels that we saw on the A6500. Outside of that, however, autofocus is a strength for the camera. So I think autofocus in many ways is the area where Sony is still ahead of competitors, but where they're not ahead really is when it comes to burst rate and then buffer depth, whereas they've been caught and surpassed by some other camera makers along the way. And so I really do think, above all, I think that the buffer depth is the big deal. 11 frames per second is a useful enough figure that I'm not put off by that at all, but the buffer depth shrinking as we progress in models is kind of unacceptable. And so I really think that that's something that Sony needs to address moving ahead for the future. But this is an excellent autofocus system, howbeit one that we have seen before. The same is true when it comes to the sensor. Sony continues to use their venerable 24 megapixel CMOS sensor that is a fantastic sensor. However, it is also a sensor we've seen in, well, many cameras before. Let's dive in and take a look at its performance.
So first of all, this is a sensor that is capable of producing really nicely detailed images. Now these days 24 megapixels is hardly off the charts, but at the same time it has been a sweet spot for a lot of APS sensors for a reason. It often strikes a good balance between giving you a good amount of resolution and lots of detail, but also not kind of pushing the limits too far as far as pixel density that allows you, as we're going to see in a moment, to continue to have good ISO performance. So we can see from this shot, for example, that it's capable of producing lots of detail. If we switch over to a landscape type image, and this was shot with the 18 to 35 millimeter, stop down a bit, but you can see as we look across the frame that there's lots of detail here in the frame and very, very nice color. Good contrast. This is a strong sensor. Here's another example where we've got lots of various textures here, and you can just see that the textures are given great detail, and so it's certainly capable of giving you beautiful photos. No limitation there. Now, what's interesting here is that we see very, very little, as we're going to explore, a difference between the sensor from the A6600 and the A6400. Now, I understand that we've been working with basically the same sensor for a number of generations. However, there were some minor tweaks that were made going to the A6400 that cleaned up image quality a bit. What I'm seeing here is that even though with both cameras operating on auto white balance under identical conditions using identical lens, they essentially produced identical results. And so this sensor really is behaving extremely similar in both cameras. And so we can see as far as the exposure, there's no difference in tuning, and the color science is very, very similar. This also helps to establish a baseline for what this setup should look like in subsequent images. So we'll explore dynamic range for a moment. Here I have already skipped over the first 2 steps of overexposure. We're at 3 steps of overexposure. So you can see if you look here on the left, there's lots of blown out areas. And we can see as we look at the right that the recovery has done quite well. And if we look up at our color swatches, most colors that had gotten kind of depleted by the overexposure have been restored fairly successfully. There's not really too much evidence of blown out spots. This is actually a really strong performance, and you can see, at various places here that were completely whited out before, that we've gotten a fairly natural recovery, even down to the timer face, that it looks natural, even though it was hugely overexposed to begin with. That's actually a very, very strong performance. The behavior is, as we can see, once again, identical to the A6400 in that both of them look basically the exact same here. And so they've both done a good job, and obviously this sensor behaves very similarly in both cameras. Now, the practical limit for the A6600 is at 4 stops of overexposure. And so you can see we're extremely washed out. And if we look back to our color swatches here, we can see that a lot of those colors that were recovered at 3 stops are no longer recovered. We can also see that there are unrecovered hot spots here where we didn't get the textures back. Things don't look natural, and the timer face, you can just see that it has kind of this unnatural result. And so there's your upper limit for the dynamic range. Now on the other end, actually, there is tremendous latitude. I've gone right past 4 stops of underexposure, and I've gone all the way to 5 stops here. And so first of all, on a global level, you can see that you're able to recover deep shadows on a global level, basically almost perfectly natural. You can see, if you're eagle-eyed, you can see that down in this area there's a little bit of color noise, and as we go into a pixel level, you can see the tiniest amount of just not so much banding, but more just some splotches of various colors there. But if we look at the actual, things that are in focus, the heart of the image, everything actually looks quite good. You can see that, before all the texture was completely lost of the grip of the Spotmatic, it's recovered quite well. And yes, there's a little tiny bit of discoloration there, but not enough that you would pick it up at anything but a pixel level. And our colors here look quite natural, and there is some noise, and ever occasionally, like here, I see a little bit of color banding, but by and large that is a pretty remarkably good recovery at a full 5 stops there of underexposure. So very strong in that regard. So what that means in the real world is that you do have a considerable amount of control over the final look of images. This is the original here on the left. I wasn't intentionally trying to do anything, but the position of the sun, exposing for the sky led to a fairly strong underexposure of the foreground. We can see that by pulling the sliders down, number one, I'm able to get back even more information in the sky, but then pulling the shadows open, it reveals a lot of detail. Now, I think this is a little too much. I think that we've lost some of the necessary contrast in the image itself, but I did want to point out this is the flexibility that you have. And so in the shadows, you have a lot of flexibility, a little less in the highlights. And so as per usual, if you're in a scene with a lot of dynamic range, I would recommend a slight underexposure rather than an overexposure. Now, we've also got a strong performance when it comes to our ISO performance. The native ISO here is 100 to 32,000, and one minor tweak that we see in the A6600 versus the A6400 is that both of them allow you to go in the expanded, as they call it, range up to 102,800. But what you can also do on the A6600 is that you can go down as low as ISO 50 in the expanded range on the low end. So starting with our base ISO, which is 100, we'll take a look at our first stop at 800 here on the right, and so you can see that the two are, basically indistinguishable. There's not really anything to see, not really hardly any additional noise, maybe the tiniest bit, but you're going to have no problem there. Likewise, if you move on up to 1600, there's really not much additional noise to be seen. There's a tiny bit there, but you can see color fidelity stays very good. I have no problem at 1600. At 3200, we can see on a global level, you really can't see any difference between it, 100 and 3200. Everything looks still quite good. If we zoom into a pixel level, you can see that on the actual subjects in focus, there's not really a lot of difference. What you can see in some of these areas that should be a little bit more neutral is that there is definitely more of that noise patterning that is there, and you can see it in some of these colors. They're just not quite as even, but obviously, as you can see, still a very strong performance. Moving on to 6400, just kind of continues that general pattern that the subject looks quite good, still very sharp, still very good contrast. Globally, the color fidelity still looks very good, but if you look in at a pixel level, you're just going to see growing amounts of visible noise. Now it's here at 12,800 that I start to see the first signs of some loss of contrast, and as the noise becomes a little bit more intense, it tends to raise shadows a little bit because of the uneven, pixels that should be dark there. It's still very usable, as you can see in good lighting situations. You won't have any problem with that. However, the higher you go up in your ISO range, the less latitude you're going to have for recovering things. So you have to be a little bit more careful to nail your exposure. Likewise, at 25,600, again, if you're not looking too close, everything looks really quite fantastic. You can see that there's been a little bit of loss of contrast, even on a global level. And of course, if we jump in, we can see that definitely the darks are not as dark as they used to be. And in some of these color swatches, you can see that they're just not retaining the darkness. And in this area, you can see it should be consistently black. There's a little bit of color splotching that is there, but again, still quite usable. Now in that final stop in the normal range, you can see that there's definitely even more contrast that has been lost, moving on from that 1/3 of 25,600 to 32,000. And so now if we look into areas that should be, even in their pixels, we can see that it's just, you're losing contrast even more so now. And so even comparing these two, you can see how much darker it is at 25,600. I would recommend that you treat 25,600 as your upper limit unless, absolutely necessary. Kind of a practical normal limit, maybe around 6,400. And then if, in worst case scenario, go up to 25,600. Definitely avoid going all the way up to the expanded range. And so here, if we look at 51,200, you can see that it's just not nearly as good. And we're even starting to lose some of the information on like this leather strap. It's just not nearly as good. And obviously everything gets much rougher. Shadows get raised a lot. And, the colors aren't quite as good if you go up that high. Here's a real-world shot at ISO 3200, and you can see that if we look kind of again at these areas that should be just kind of consistently colored, you can see a little bit of shadow information. But what really impresses me is how crisp and good the contrast still is. Now in people's faces, I do tend to find that noise shows up a little bit more, and it's maybe a little bit less attractive. But at the same time, this image looked at globally, it looks great, certainly very usable. And so at the end of the day, I think that there's some very, very usable ISO range in this little camera.
So as noted in the intro to this section, this really is a fantastic sensor. I mean, it does so many things well, but at the same time, this is essentially the same dynamic range we've seen for quite a long time. It is basically the same ISO performance. We've got just that tiny tweak to where we can drop down to a ISO 50 in the expanded range, whereas that wasn't an option on like the A6400. But these sensors behave identically in my test, and so it's a great sensor, but at the same time it's nothing new. And I think that kind of comes down to the conclusion that I've been building towards. And I noted that I'm reviewing the a6600 much later than its initial release date. That's for really a couple of reasons. The first is that when I looked over the specifications and the the release information about the a6600, my response was, because on paper it looked like pretty much more of the same, and I couldn't really see any major innovation. And having used and owned the camera, I can say that my initial reaction was accurate. In fact, I ended up buying the a6600 because I do need a camera like it. And it is the best of its kind from Sony right now. And I've got lots of Sony lenses, and I'm very invested in the Sony ecosystem. And so I actually ended up buying a used copy that I got a good price on, because I wasn't really inspired enough by it at its release to spend the money and to make the effort of getting one, or even of jumping on to reviewing it at this point. And I suspect that the market response to the a6600 has been a little bit, kind of like mine, in that it's a great camera, but Sony has been known as a company that innovates, that is ahead of the pack. And in a lot of areas, it's no longer ahead of the pack. This, camera tops off at 4K 30, for example, with a significant 1.6 times crop factor in 4K. That makes a big deal, and it means that some lenses, they're not hardly usable because there's so much of a crop factor. It means getting wide angle shots is much more difficult. There are just a number of challenges that come as a part of that. And frankly, the competition has moved past that. In many cases, you're easily getting 4K 60 from some Fuji competitors without that kind of crop factor. You've got, a variety of other factors that are at play there. And while I think Sony is still probably the best when it comes to the focus during video capture, and that's the reason why I own a Sony instead of a Fuji, because for what I need to do, I need to rely, like I am right now, that it's going to track my face accurately, and I haven't found Fuji cameras do that. There's too much pulsing and they just don't settle well enough, and so Fuji's got its own problems, yes. But at the same time, there are also areas where Fuji has definitely moved beyond. Better ergonomics, faster burst rates, and various aspects like that. Much more diverse control over video and video codecs and frame rates, etc. And so there is definitely room for improvement at this point. In many ways, the a6600 feels like a placeholder, in that Sony has, tied together the loose ends of its various aspects of technology, the in-body image stabilization from the a6500, the improved autofocus from the a6400, and now even a battery from the A7 series, all of which is welcome in one package. But there's not really anything new here either. And so I think that this is a camera that Sony put out to kind of satisfy the market while they innovate for its replacement. And in some ways that shows. And so if you are someone that is interested in purchasing one, this is a great camera. And this review is not designed to discourage you from doing so. It is the best of its kind from Sony at this point. But at the same time, as a message to Sony, we see what you're doing here, and this camera should be a lot better than what it is, and we're ready for more great Sony innovation. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery, lots of great photos there, so I recommend you go check that out. There are some buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, also linkage to purchase some of my merchandise, some lens-themed clothing. There's also linkage there to follow me on social media, to become a patron, or to sign up for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Be sure to ring that bell so you get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.